The city of Boston was waking up. Early spring had the streets of Roxbury buzzing with life, mothers walking their children to school, corner stores opening their doors, and buses rolling down Washington Street. For Anne Wallace, the morning rush was both a chore and a comfort. Her days were predictable, filled with routines that gave her a sense of control in a world that sometimes felt chaotic. Standing in her modest kitchen, Anne hummed softly to herself as she flipped pancakes on the griddle. The smell of butter and syrup mingled with the cool morning air drifting in through a cracked window. It was one of those rare mornings when she felt calm. "Mommy, Mommy!" CJ's tiny voice called out from the living room, where the 3-year-old was sprawled on the carpet, his favorite blue truck in hand. "What is it, baby?" Anne called back, keeping one eye on the griddle. CJ came running into the kitchen, his little arms outstretched. "I want to help," Anne chuckled, scooping him up and plopping him on the counter. "All right, Chef CJ, you can help me stir the batter." Her son giggled, grabbing the spoon with chubby fingers and making an enthusiastic mess. Anne didn't mind. Moments like these reminded her why she'd chosen to stay home instead of returning to her job as a receptionist at a medical office. Life wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Jude's heavy footfalls signaled his arrival in the kitchen. At 6'3", he had a commanding presence that often made strangers stop and look twice. He was wearing his usual work uniform: faded jeans, a thermal shirt, and a tool belt slung over one shoulder. His face was rugged, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that were both warm and intense. "Mornin', beautiful," he said, leaning in to kiss Anne on the cheek. "Good morning," she replied, handing him a plate of pancakes. "You gonna eat this time, or just inhale it like usual?" Jude laughed. "A man's gotta eat, babe. You want me fainting on the job?" Anne rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. They'd been together for 7 years, married for 4. Their relationship had its ups and downs, but Jude had a way of making her feel safe, a rock she could lean on, even when times were tough. As Jude sat at the table, CJ climbed onto his lap, babbling excitedly about the truck he'd built out of Legos the day before. Jude listened intently, nodding and grinning in all the right places. It was one of the things Anne loved most about him. No matter how tired he was, he always made time for their son. After breakfast, Jude grabbed his keys and kissed both Anne and CJ goodbye. "I'll be home by 6, he said, slinging his tool belt over his shoulder. "Don't forget, movie and pizza night." "We'll hold you to that," Anne replied, watching him disappear out the door. She turned back to the kitchen, ready to tackle the mountain of dishes CJ had managed to dirty in less than an hour. As she worked, her mind wandered to Jude's mention of Andre Miller. Andre had been a name from Jude's past, a childhood friend from their days growing up in the same Roxbury neighborhood. Anne had met Andre once, years ago, at a barbecue Jude's mom had hosted. He'd been charming, with a big laugh and an even bigger personality. But Jude had never seemed completely at ease around him. "Y'all seem close," Anne had commented later that night. Jude's expression had darkened. "We were, back in the day," he'd said. "But people change." That had been the end of it. Jude never brought Andre up again, and Anne never pressed. She figured it was just one of those old friendships that didn't survive the test of time. Now, she wondered what had prompted Andre to reach out after all these years. Roxbury was a neighborhood of contrasts, a vibrant, close-knit community with a rich history, but also a place where dreams often collided with harsh realities. Anne loved the sense of pride that permeated the neighborhood. The brightly painted murals celebrating Black culture, the smell of fresh patties wafting from the Jamaican bakery on the corner, and the neighbors who always greeted her with a smile. But Roxbury wasn't without its struggles. Gun violence and poverty cast long shadows over the community. Anne had grown up here, so she knew how to navigate its complexities. She was proud to still live in the neighborhood, raising CJ in the same streets where she'd played as a child. Jude, on the other hand, had a more complicated relationship with Roxbury. He'd seen too many friends fall into the wrong crowd, Andre among them. When Jude met Anne, he'd been determined to carve out a better life, a life free from the baggage of his past. That's why it struck her as odd that Andre was suddenly back in the picture. Jude wasn't one to dwell on the past, but he couldn't stop thinking about Andre's text. Andre Miller had been more than a friend. He'd been like a brother. They'd grown up together, sharing everything from basketball games at the local park to whispered secrets about their dreams for the future. But as they got older, their paths had diverged. While Jude worked hard to build a career in construction, Andre had taken a different route. He'd gotten involved with the wrong people. Fast money, dangerous deals, and an attitude that seemed to court trouble. The last time Jude had seen Andre, it hadn't ended well. There had been an argument, sharp words exchanged. Jude had walked away, determined to leave Andre's chaos behind. Now, years later, that chaos seemed to be knocking on his door again. That evening, Jude came home later than expected. His boots were caked with mud and his face looked drawn. "Rough day?" Anne asked as he dropped his bag by the door. "You could say that," he replied, rubbing the back of his neck. Anne didn't push. Jude wasn't the type to open up about work stress. He carried his burdens quietly, the way a man taught by his father to be tough often did. But as the night wore on, Anne noticed that Jude seemed distracted. He barely touched his dinner and spent most of the evening scrolling through his phone, his expression unreadable. When she finally climbed into bed, Anne turned to him. "You sure everything's okay?" "Yeah," Jude said, pulling the covers up. "Just tired." But as Anne drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The following day started like any other for Anne Wallace. CJ was running laps around the living room in his pajamas, his toy truck clutched tightly in one hand. Anne was attempting to tidy up before starting breakfast, occasionally shouting playful warnings. "CJ, you run too fast and you'll end up kissing that floor." CJ giggled and kept running, his little feet thundering against the hardwood. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows as Anne switched on the small kitchen TV. It wasn't a habit of hers to watch much news, but the local Boston station was her go-to for weather updates. She stirred the pot of oatmeal on the stove, only half listening to the anchor droning on about a proposed tax hike and school board elections. Then her ears perked up at the mention of Dorchester, a neighborhood she knew well. The anchor's voice turned somber. "Breaking news out of Dorchester this morning, where police are investigating the discovery of a man's body in an apartment complex on Quincy Street. The victim has been identified as 34-year-old Andre Miller." Anne froze, her hand hovering over the stovetop. She stared at the TV screen as the anchor continued. "Miller's body was discovered late yesterday after neighbors reported a foul odor coming from his apartment. Investigators are calling this a homicide after initial reports revealed the victim suffered multiple stab wounds." A photo of Andre flashed on the screen, the same face she remembered from years ago. He looked slightly older now, the sharp jawline softened by time and worry. Anne's heart raced as the details sank in. "Authorities are urging anyone with information to contact the Boston Police Department. We'll bring you updates as this story develops." Anne turned off the burner, her appetite gone. She grabbed her phone and dialed Jude. "Hello," he answered, his voice distracted. "Did you hear about Andre?" There was a pause. "Yeah, I saw the news," Jude replied, his tone tight. "Jude, what the hell happened? He was just texting you, wasn't he?" "Anne, I don't know," he said sharply. "I haven't seen Andre in years. I don't know what he got himself into." Anne frowned. Jude sounded defensive, more defensive than he needed to be. "You sure? You seemed weird about him the other day." "I'm telling you, I don't know anything," Jude snapped. Then softening his tone, he added, "Look, babe, I gotta get back to work. We'll talk later, all right?" "Yeah," Anne said quietly, hanging up. Her chest felt tight. Something about Jude's tone had unsettled her. News of Andre's murder spread quickly through Roxbury and neighboring Dorchester. The tight-knit communities were no strangers to violence, but the brutal nature of Andre's death had people whispering. At the corner store that afternoon, Anne overheard a heated conversation between two women. "You hear about Andre Miller?" one of them asked, leaning on the counter. "Girl, yes," the other replied, shaking her head. "They say he was stabbed up bad. Like, whoever did it wanted him gone." "I heard the same thing," the first woman said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Word is, he was mixed up with some bad people." Anne paid for her groceries and left quickly, her mind spinning. Could this have been some kind of revenge? A robbery gone wrong? Detective Lorraine Matthews stood in the center of Andre Miller's living room, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. She was a seasoned investigator, having spent over 15 years working homicide cases in Boston. Her no-nonsense demeanor and knack for spotting the tiniest inconsistencies had earned her a reputation as one of the best. Her partner, Detective Ray Carter, stood by the kitchen sink, his gloved hands holding the blood-stained knife that had been left behind. "Sloppy," Carter muttered, placing the weapon into an evidence bag. "Sloppy or panicked," Matthews replied. She crouched to examine the floor, where bloody footprints were faintly visible. This wasn't just about killing him, it was personal. Overkill. The apartment was in chaos, furniture overturned, broken glass scattered across the floor, and blood smeared on the walls. The faint smell of bleach lingered, evidence that someone had tried to clean up but hadn't finished the job. "Neighbors say they heard arguing 2 nights ago," Carter said, flipping through his notebook. "Around 9 p.m., someone said they heard shouting, followed by a loud crash." "Let's get the prints from that knife and start talking to people," Matthews said, standing. "Someone saw something. They always do." When Jude came home that evening, Anne was waiting for him. She'd spent the day in a daze trying to make sense of her feelings. "Long day?" she asked as Jude kicked off his boots. "Yeah," he muttered, dropping his bag by the door. Anne studied him closely. There was something off about the way he moved. Stiff, guarded, like he was carrying a weight he couldn't put down. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," Jude said quickly, brushing past her to head to the bedroom. Anne followed him. "You sure? You've been acting weird ever since you heard about Andre." Jude turned to face her, his expression hard. "What do you want me to say, Anne? That it's messed up? That I feel bad for the guy? I do, but I don't know what you want from me." Anne frowned, taken aback by his tone. "I'm not asking for anything, Jude. I thought maybe you'd want to talk about it." "There's nothing to talk about," Jude said firmly. Anne dropped the subject, but the tension lingered between them. That night, as Jude slept beside her, Anne lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the conversation from dinner, dissecting every word, every nuance in Jude's tone. He was hiding something, she was sure of it. The next morning, while Jude was in the shower, Anne noticed his phone vibrating on the nightstand. A text preview flashed on the screen. "We need to talk. This is getting out of control." Her stomach flipped. The sender's name wasn't saved, just a number she didn't recognize. She wanted to unlock the phone, but Jude always kept it locked with a passcode. "Anne?" Jude's voice called from the bathroom. She quickly set the phone back down, her heart pounding. "Yeah? Can you grab me a towel?" Anne handed him the towel, forcing a smile as he stepped out of the shower. But inside, her mind was racing. The next few days passed in a blur. Anne went through the motions of her daily routine, but her thoughts were consumed by the gnawing suspicion that Jude knew more about Andre's murder than he was letting on. She thought back to the last time Andre had come up in conversation. Jude had been reluctant to talk about him, brushing off her questions. Now, with Andre dead, Jude's behavior was raising red flags she couldn't ignore. At night, she'd lie awake listening to the sound of Jude's breathing, wondering what secrets he was keeping. Anne couldn't let go of the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in her gut. Jude had always been a private man, the kind of person who believed that some things, especially anything that could be considered messy, should stay unspoken. But this was different. The night she saw the mysterious text on his phone, her thoughts spiraled. Who was texting him? What was out of control? And why did Jude seem so on edge every time Andre's name was mentioned? Anne decided she couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Something wasn't right, and she needed answers. The next morning, Jude left for work early, just as he always did. After he was gone, Anne sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, staring at his phone charger still plugged into the wall. He hadn't left his phone behind, of course. Jude was too careful for that. But Anne couldn't shake the feeling that if she could just get her hands on his phone, she might find something, anything, that explained why he was acting so strange. CJ toddled into the room, his truck clutched in one hand. "Mommy, play with me?" Anne smiled, brushing his curls back from his face. "Of course, baby." But even as she sat on the floor building block towers with her son, her mind was elsewhere. Later that afternoon, Anne decided to call someone who might have answers. She grabbed her phone and dialed Tanya, their upstairs neighbor and Anne's go-to source for local gossip. Tanya always seemed to know what was going on, sometimes even before the news did. "Hey, girl," Tanya answered, her voice bright. "Hey," Anne said, trying to sound casual. "You hear anything new about what happened to Andre?" Tanya sighed dramatically. "Oh, everybody's talking about it. Some people say it was a deal gone bad. Others are saying it was a friend or somebody he knew." Anne's heart skipped a beat. Why would they think that? "Well, you know how it is," Tanya said. "When someone gets stabbed like that, that's personal. You don't stab someone unless you're mad or it's revenge or something. That's what my cousin says anyway. He used to be a cop." Anne felt a chill run down her spine. "Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Why? You know something?" Tanya asked, her tone suddenly sharp. Anne hesitated. "No, just wondering." Anne sat in silence after the call, her mind drifting back to the one time she'd met Andre. It had been at a summer barbecue at Jude's mother's house, years ago. Anne had only been dating Jude for a few months at the time, and she was still getting to know his family and friends. Andre had arrived late, bursting through the backyard gate with a loud, "What's up, y'all?" He was charismatic, with a laugh that seemed to light up the whole yard. But even then, Anne had sensed something off about him. Maybe it was the way his eyes scanned the crowd, as if he were always on the lookout for trouble. Jude had stiffened the moment Andre arrived. He'd plastered on a smile and greeted his old friend with a quick hug, but his body language told a different story. Later, when they were alone, Anne had asked about it. "You and Andre seem close," she'd said. Jude had shrugged. "We grew up together, but people change, you know?" She'd left it at that, sensing it was a sore subject. But now, years later, she wondered if that moment had been a warning sign she'd missed. A few nights later, Anne finally worked up the nerve to confront Jude, carefully, without accusing him outright. They were sitting on the couch, CJ already tucked into bed, the TV playing a rerun of Family Feud. Jude had a beer in one hand, his phone in the other, scrolling aimlessly. "Have you talked to anybody about Andre?" Anne asked casually, not taking her eyes off the screen. Jude tensed but didn't look up. "What do you mean? Like, the detectives, have they called you or anything?" "No," Jude said quickly. "Why would they?" Anne turned to him, trying to keep her expression neutral. "I don't know. You said he texted you before he died. I just thought they might want to talk to everyone who knew him." Jude's jaw tightened. "I haven't heard from anyone, Anne. Can we drop it?" Anne nodded, but her mind was racing. His reaction had been too defensive, his tone too sharp. Later that night, as Jude slept beside her, Anne replayed the conversation in her head. And then, something clicked. Something Jude had said earlier that evening. They'd been watching the news when a segment about Andre's murder came on. Jude had made an offhand comment. They must not have had time to clean up properly if they left the knife out. Anne hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it hit her like a bolt of lightning. The news reports hadn't mentioned a knife. The next morning, Anne couldn't focus. Every time she looked at Jude, her mind replayed his words. They must not have had time to clean up properly if they left the knife out. She tried to tell herself she was imagining things, that she was reading too much into an innocent comment. But the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. "Are you okay?" Jude asked, watching her pick at her breakfast. "Yeah," Anne said quickly. "Just didn't sleep well." Jude gave her a concerned look, but didn't press. A few days later, while Jude was out running errands, Anne decided to clean out the closet in their bedroom. CJ was napping, and she figured it was as good a time as any to tackle the pile of clutter Jude had been promising to go through for months. She was sorting through old jackets and shoes when her hand brushed against something strange, a crumpled hoodie stuffed into the back corner of the closet. Anne pulled it out, frowning. The fabric felt stiff, almost crunchy. She held it up, and her breath caught in her throat. There was a dark stain on the sleeve. Her hands trembled as she dropped the hoodie back into the closet. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, but deep down, she already knew. Anne sat on the edge of the bed, her mind spinning. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the evidence was piling up. Jude's strange behavior, his defensive attitude, the slip about the knife, and now this. She had to do something. Anne spent the next 2 days in a fog of anxiety. Every time Jude walked into the room, She felt her stomach churn. She couldn't shake the image of the blood-stained hoodie buried in their closet or the memory of Jude's slip about the knife. She tried to act normal, but her efforts were shaky at best. Jude, perceptive as ever, started noticing. "You've been quiet," he said one evening as they sat at the dinner table. CJ was busy smashing a handful of mashed potatoes into his plate, oblivious to the tension between his parents. Anne forced a smile. "Just tired." Jude narrowed his eyes slightly, but he didn't press. The air between them felt heavier than ever. That night, after Jude had gone to bed, Anne sat in the living room with her phone clutched tightly in her hands. She stared at the number for the Boston Police Department's homicide unit, the one Detective Lorraine Matthews had mentioned on the news. Her heart raced as she debated what to do. If she made the call, there would be no going back. But if she stayed silent, she might never forgive herself. Taking a deep breath, she dialed. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered, brisk and professional. "This is Detective Matthews." Anne's voice trembled as she spoke. "Hi, my name is Anne Wallace. I think my husband might know something about Andre Miller's murder." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Wallace," Matthews said carefully, "can you tell me what makes you think that?" Anne hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the bedroom where Jude was sleeping. Then she poured everything out, the slip about the knife, the blood-stained hoodie, the way Jude had been acting ever since Andre's death. When she finished, there was another pause. "Thank you for telling me this," Matthews said finally. "We'll take it from here. Please don't mention this call to your husband." Anne hung up, her hands shaking. She felt a mix of relief and dread. The following morning was eerily normal. Jude kissed her goodbye before heading to work, oblivious to what was coming. Around noon, Anne received a call from Detective Matthews. "We've arrested your husband, Mrs. Wallace," Matthews said. "We'd like you to come down to the station to answer a few questions." Anne sat on the couch, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. It felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. "I'll be there," she said quietly. Jude's arrest had been swift and public. The detectives had shown up at his construction site with a warrant, handcuffing him in front of his coworkers. "What the hell is this?" Jude had shouted, his voice a mix of anger and panic. "You're under arrest for the murder of Andre Miller," one of the officers said. Jude had gone pale. At the station, Jude sat in a cold, windowless room, his hands cuffed to the table. Detective Matthews and her partner, Carter, sat across from him. "Mr. Wallace," Matthews began, her tone calm but firm, "we have reason to believe you were involved in the murder of Andre Miller." "I didn't kill him," Jude said quickly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Matthews placed a photo of the blood-stained hoodie on the table. "This was found in your home. Care to explain?" Jude's jaw clenched. "I don't know how that got there." "Your fingerprints were also found on the knife at the crime scene," Carter added. Jude's eyes widened. "That's not possible. I wasn't there." "Then how do you explain this?" Matthews asked, sliding a copy of Jude's phone records across the table. "Your phone pinged near Andre's apartment the night he was killed." Jude's facade began to crack. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Go on," Matthews prompted. Jude hesitated, then began to speak. According to Jude, Andre had reached out to him a few weeks before his death, claiming he needed help. He said he was in trouble with some dangerous people and needed money to make it go away. Jude had been hesitant but agreed to meet him. They'd argued in Andre's apartment, and things had quickly escalated. Andre had accused Jude of turning his back on their friendship, of abandoning him when he needed him most. "He started pushing me," Jude said, his voice trembling. "He wouldn't let it go. I snapped. I grabbed the knife off the counter, and I didn't stop." Jude buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I panicked. I tried to clean up, but I didn't know what I was doing. I left and just acted like it didn't happen." Matthews and Carter exchanged a glance. "Why didn't you come forward?" Matthews asked. Jude looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "Because I didn't want to lose my family." Anne sat in a small, stark room at the police station, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Detective Matthews entered, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Wallace," she began, Your husband has confessed to killing Andre Miller. Anne felt the air leave her lungs. Matthews explained the details. Andre's blackmail, the argument, the moment of violence. With every word, Anne felt her world crumbling around her. Jude was charged with second-degree murder. At his arraignment, Anne sat in the back of the courtroom, her heart heavy as she watched him plead guilty. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. For weeks after the trial, Anne struggled to process what had happened. She felt a mix of guilt, anger, and grief. She'd loved Jude, but now she didn't know if she'd ever truly known him.